So on your seat is this magnificent piece of work. It sort of, I don't know, caps maybe a decade or more of work that you've been doing, maybe even more than that. I'm here with Dr. Frederica Perera, the author of this fantastic book, Children's Health and the Peril of Climate Change. And we're going to have a conversation about why she wrote it and her vision for a zero carbon future. I've been really struck by some of the metaphors that have come out and some of the insights along the way. One of which is I've been in the early childhood and the media field for a really long time. This notion that Nat Kendall Taylor brought of parallel play and how we need to play together, that he spent 20 years on the communications of climate and 20 years on the communication of early childhood development, and never the twain shall meet. So it's meeting now. Ricky, why did you write this book? What sort of stimulated after all these years of accomplishment and work within academia and public health and policy circles prompted you to write this magnificent synthetic book?
Well, thank you very much. Can you all hear me all right?
I think it's good.
Yay, okay, and I hope the book's comfortable to sit on. Okay.
It's an alarming colored.
I think it is. It was meant to be a wake-up call. So I wrote the book as a wake-up call because in my own life and in my own career, I've had a series of wake-up calls. And I'll just go back a little bit. When I was just a graduate of Columbia School of Public Health then, and started a career in cancer research, believe it or not. And I had been looking for a pristine human sample to use as a control, as a sample that I could compare to the samples from adults who'd been exposed to air pollution and other toxic chemicals. And much to my surprise, dismay, I found that umbilical cord blood, the blood of newborns, their DNA contained the same molecular fingerprint on DNA that my colleagues and I had been measuring in adults with exposure to these chemicals. And I thought, well, that dispelled the myth of the placenta being a pretty good barrier, a very good barrier against toxic intrusions from the mother's environment. And so that was my first wake-up call, and I decided with my colleagues to establish the Columbia Center for Children's Environmental Health to do long-term studies of pregnant mothers and their children. The oldest children in our first cohort are 23 years old, and some are having children of their own. So we've been at it for a while. And we wanted to look at the long-term effects of these prenatal and then early postnatal exposures on the health and brain development of children. Well, I'll tell you a little more about that later, but the second wake-up call was in the 70s. We were seeing an escalation of the climate crisis. It was becoming pretty apparent. And for me, I realized that air pollution that we were studying and climate change both had the same root cause: fossil fuel combustion, mainly, 80% of both due to fossil fuel. And that we needed to pull these two previously traditionally siloed problems together, put them together and assess their risks, their impacts holistically, and then do much better at assessing the benefits of policies to curb the emissions in a holistic way again. And I've been thinking a lot about the interactions between the two. We've already seen those with preterm birth and heat and air pollution collaborating to increase risk of preterm birth, and asthma hospitalizations in children. And there's some evidence now that climate change and air pollution are also collaborating to increase risk of mental health problems and cognitive developmental problems. So those are the two wake-up calls that triggered my interest in putting this all together, but also the fact that so many people and so many policymakers and government leaders have been asleep at the switch, and they needed to wake up. And they've been, well, some not necessarily asleep, but maybe some deniers, but mainly, I think, because people weren't aware of all the risks and they didn't understand the benefits, and they didn't understand that policies were available, solutions were available now, and that they were not too costly. We often hear that. So that's why I put it all together in the book. First part is sort of sobering. It's on the challenge and the problem. And the second part is hopeful. It's the voices of all the groups, youth, EJ groups, indigenous groups, all the wonderful groups that have gotten together and spoken out, called for action, and then the solutions and some success stories, which Mike was going to ask you about.
So thank you for that overview. We've heard a lot from others, on the panels about some of the sort of opportunities and risks. And we've just begun in the last couple of panels to focus in on success stories or things that might be scalable. I loved especially the framing conversation this morning in which, Nat and Gary and Liz kind of talked about, let's think about the year 2040. Let's think about the future or the notion of a shared future. We heard a little bit about Boston just now. I know work is going on in London and other places. What are some of the success stories that give us hope that we can address these issues at scale?
Michael, you took the questions out of order. You were supposed to ask me about the impacts.
Well, what are the impacts that are leading to success stories?
Thank you.
I'm malleable.
You're very kind, and I'm very, stick to the script. So we have to think about the long list, but I'm not going to drag you through the whole thing of harms that are being inflicted on the young right now, even before they're born. And we start with heat. We all know that heat causes heat-related illness and even deaths in infants and children. Are you aware that heat also causes preterm birth or is a contributor to preterm birth? Asthma and allergy are increasing in children because of the extended pollen seasons.
I can feel it right now.
I know. And children breathe, 7 million children in the US breathe forest fire smoke, which is a trigger for asthma attacks. And then we have the severe storms, which are increasing the risk of physical trauma and also mental health issues, psychological trauma. So, and I forgot infectious disease such as Lyme and dengue and malaria, which have been spreading due to climate change as the insects that carry them have extended their range. So there are many ills that are afflicting children from
Just in case you didn't have echo anxiety before.
You want me to talk about climate anxiety? Yes. So 3 different speakers have spoken about climate anxiety and the survey of children in 10 countries, and 60% said they were worried, very worried about climate change. 50% said it was affecting their daily lives. That's not mental health issue per se, problem per se, clinical problem, but it is a risk factor for mental health issues. Now, I mentioned climate change, but look at air pollution. Does some of the same things. Preterm birth, asthma exacerbation, triggers asthma attacks in children with asthma, but now we know it also causes asthma. And we at Columbia, at the Center for Children's Environmental Health, and others have shown the links between air pollution exposure prenatally, some postnatally, on cognitive function, on behavioral problems, on mental health issues like anxiety, depression, ADHD, our studies have shown, and also autism. And so there's a whole array of ills from air pollution, and I mentioned earlier the potential for them to interact, possibly in a synergistic, multiplicative way.
So what are you seeing out there? We're convinced and sad and mobilized.
Yes.
What are you seeing out there in terms of whether it's, population-based or city or, nationally or globally based solutions to the problems?
Yes, sure. Well, the solutions do include, the heavy lifting has to be done by government through policies, and we've had a lot of good discussion about those. And also there are a lot that individuals can do that also I think we've talked about in our own lives and, to reduce our carbon footprint. We could go through that.
What would be the 2 most important things we could do individually?
Okay, well, right now I think we need to support the policies or the Inflation Reduction Act opportunities, make those available to communities who need help and access to those funds. and that has been mentioned. But we also need, and also others have spoken of this, child-centered policies, and we need a national commitment, international, hopefully, commitment to center those policies on the needs and vulnerability of the young. And I haven't mentioned why children and the young are so vulnerable, but I could if you ask me. And those.
I think we know. I do.
Well, I guess we do.
I think we do. I think we do. This is a crowd that
If you
doesn't
want to
need
know,
be.
just raise your hand.
And it's in the book. But yeah, I really do want to talk more about the solutions.
Yes, so let's get on to this. So solutions do exist. They're available now, and they're cost effective. So let's give some examples. Well, a lot of people sort of bring out the fact that the Clean Air Act amendments over time have resulted in $2 trillion worth of avoided costs through the health and other benefits that they've achieved, far exceeding the cost by as much as 30-fold. The same kind of cost-benefit analysis was done for California, and there too the benefits exceeded costs by a large factor. But I've been very interested in the work in many cities around the world. I've studied Krakow, Poland, and cities in China, but right here in New York City, we've seen policies that have clean air and climate policies that have made a huge difference. Anyone lived here for a long time?
Yes.
Have you noticed the change in air quality?
Absolutely.
Not perfect, way to go, but much better because there were policies put in place in the last decades to clean up the taxi and bus fleet and also to phase out the really dirty residential fuel oil that was being burned in many buildings around the city. So the air quality has improved greatly citywide by, if you look at particulate matter, fine respirable particles, about a 40% drop in the levels of those airborne particles, which are so toxic. And then also in our cohort studies where we followed mothers, pregnant mothers and children, we've looked at the air pollution exposure, particulate matter and nitrogen dioxide at the air, in the ambient air around the residences where they lived at the time of pregnancy. And we used models to do that. And the drop in levels of particulate matter was large. It was 50%. That's good news. And that's good news for the mothers and also for the children. But now we've gone further with other analyses of policies that have been put in place, and we have real record of what they've achieved quantitatively. So one of them is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Anyone heard of that? It's called RGGI for short. And that in its first and that was a policy, climate policy, in the northeastern states, mid-Atlantic states. And in its first 5 years, it achieved a pretty dramatic reduction in air pollution. It contributed to a drop, a significant drop in levels of these pollutants, which were equated to I think it was 28,000 avoided cases of illness and death in adults and children, and a economic benefit in avoided health costs of $8 billion, and that was good news. And then if we go to London, I think some people here were just in London, the policies to curb emissions, the ultra emissions zone in central London, in its first 3 years of implementation, has achieved a 44% drop in levels of nitrogen dioxide. That's a pollutant that comes out of the tailpipes of vehicles, as you know. And we can ascribe thousands of avoided preterm births, asthma cases, and neurodevelopmental problems as a result of that improvement.
Just absolutely fascinating data. I could talk to you for, hours about this. We only have about a minute, and we've got a really interesting group of folks here from each of the pivotal, sectors, media, philanthropy, policy, practice, community. What's the one must do as folks kind of move back into their organizational life or into their personal life that you would urge this community to do, either individually or collectively?
Yes, well, I do think that the media has a huge role. We've heard a lot about that in education of children, and who, by the way, are the best messengers to their parents, grandparents, and others about the need to act. And the media being engaged in education of children from a young age to empower them, and then also to create messengers and good voters. The other thing is philanthropy historically has not measured up to the urgency and scale of the problems, although recently there have been large pledges from major philanthropic organizations, and that's wonderful. But there needs to be more, and more sustained funding. 1 to 2 year grants are just not enough. Not enough to really get the thing going and see the benefits, the impacts, and what needs to be corrected. So those are two things I think can be done.
Those are great. And I would just add, in addition to my thanks, a personal note that one of the things that philanthropy and policy need to do is to support younger people, younger scholars who are coming up through the ranks of places like the Mailman School and others. And I just wanted to note that my daughter, Sarah Levine, who's a student and a colleague of Ricky, is here, and she helped her a bit with this book. So say hello to Sarah. And thank you very much, Ricky.
Thank you, Sarah.
Where's Sarah? Thank you very much.
Thank you all.